Hello, everybody. I bet you were just sitting there wondering, Dr. K, how does natural selection work? Well, I'll tell you. Let's go. So, natural selection, and we've been kind of hammering this point home a fair amount, but I want to make sure you got it. So, it all is about reproduction, about getting those genes into the next generation. Unequal reproduction, because some people live long enough to reproduce and other individuals don't. And so this is where the term survival of the fittest came along. And again, Darwin didn't come up with this term. He was descent with modification. But this guy, Herbert Spencer, used the term survival of the fittest to summarize the process of natural selection. So natural selection favors traits, again, that already exist, that increase survival so that it leads to improved reproduction and getting those genes in the next generation. So, and again, it may be just that you survive long enough to be old enough to reproduce, reach sexual maturity. All right. Any trait that improves survival increases the number of opportunities to reproduce. The main thing that drives natural selection and descent with modification is differences in reproductive success. Okay, so individuals with certain alleles leave more offspring who also inherit those alleles than do other alleles with different offspring. Okay, individuals with greater lifetime reproductive success have greater evolutionary fitness. All right. And we keep saying natural selection selects for traits that already exist. And what we mean, of course, if you remember from genetics, when we say traits, is a phenotype. Natural selection acts on phenotypes: beak size, tail length, neck length, whatever. So it works on a phenotype, okay? And it doesn't directly act on a genotype, but of course, when you select a given phenotype, you're really selecting for the genotype that codes for that phenotype. Okay, phenotypes and genotypes are very closely related. Okay. All right. This is again our little causes for evolution, our microevolution table. So again, we've got gene flow, genetic drift, and natural selection. In addition, mutation, non-random mating, and just a little bit of detail about each one. You guys can read that on your own time. Okay, so back to natural selection. So some phenotypes reproduce more successfully than others. Okay, and those are the ones that have the best adaptations to survive long enough in that environment. An adaptation is a characteristic that provides, that helps an individual to survive long enough to reproduce. Some phenotypes are more successful than others, and one thing that acts as an agent for selection of a certain phenotype is competition. Competition is interaction among organisms competing for the same resources and for scarce resources. Okay, most competition is the most intense among members of the same species because they all require the same thing. Okay, so that'll kind of have the most driving point. But of course, there are also competition that exists from members of different species. And if you have a member of different species, one example of competition between members of different species can be a predator-prey relationship, okay? So when two different species interact, each exerts selective pressures on the other one, okay? Predation is an interaction which one organism, which is the predator, kills and eats the other organism, which is the prey. All right, so we can look at kind of evolution between predator and prey. And when one evolves a new feature or modifies an old one, the other typically evolves new adaptations in response, okay, when you have two species working together. And this process is called coevolution, when you have two species evolving together based on each other. Okay. And again, predator-prey relationships is the most common form of coevolution. This is they call it the biological arms race. And if you think about it, if you have wolves preying on deer, if the deer is slow and careless, they're going to get eaten. And it selects against slow deer, and it selects for fast deer. Okay. But then you have a lot of fast deer. Alert, swift deer select against slow, clumsy wolves. You've got to be a pretty good wolf in order to get a fast deer. Okay. And they just kind of feed back and forth on each other. Antibiotic resistant is another way, another really beautiful example of natural selection. Again, natural selection does not cause genetic changes. Genetic changes have already occurred, and make something more fit for the environment. Okay, so natural selection does act on individuals, but individuals themselves don't evolve. Populations are changed by evolution. Okay, and evolution isn't progressive or goal-oriented. It doesn't make organisms better overall. It makes them better suited for their environment. But if the environment changes, then it's not just kind of an overall better organism. We're not trying to build the best version. All right. A couple of other types of selection. One type is sexual selection. Sexual selection favors traits that help an organism successfully mate and reproduce. Okay. So helps an organism acquire a mate. Sexual selection can be driven by a couple of things: sexual contests between males, or by female preference for particular phenotypes. So basically, you can just have, say, contests between males. You can have two rams fighting, and whichever one wins gets to mate with the females that are there. Or you can have females that decide, this is what birds do mostly, that females decide based on the flashiest, showiest tail feathers who they would select to mate with. Okay. So again, male structures, colors, displays, fancy dances, they don't necessarily enhance survival, but instead they provide a female outward signs of a male's condition. And kind of the best, hardiest males are the ones that the females want to mate with. Okay, so brightest, most ornamented male is also choosing the healthiest, most vigorous male, and they have the best genes to pass on. And of course, the primary example of sexual selection, boom, the peacock. Okay, you really don't get any flashier and showier than that. Okay, last thing we're going to talk about in this section are the three types of natural selection, or three ways that selection can influence population. One is directional selection. Directional selection favors individuals across a spectrum of phenotypes, and it selects one of the extremes and selects against the intermediate or average individuals and the individuals at the opposite extreme. Okay, and we'll have a nice graphic on the next page that'll help explain that. Okay, the second one is stabilizing selection. Stabilizing selection favors individuals with kind of average or intermediate phenotypes and selects against the extremes. And disruptive selection favors both extremes of a trait and selects against the intermediates. Okay, so if we look at little graphs here, so here's before the selection and then after the selection. So you have a directional selection here. You have size. So this would be small. Oh, didn't mean to do that. There we go. So this size would be small and this size would be large. And so if you have selective pressure that is, favoring the larger individuals, the smaller individuals will be selected against, and it will shift towards the larger individuals. So larger individuals become much more common. Okay, and you lose all the small individuals. That's directional. Stabilizing selection selects against the extremes. So we don't want the large, we don't want the small. We'll just take the average in the middle. So it kind of narrows the peak. Okay, it selects against both extremes, and you'll get an enrichment in the intermediate phenotypes. Okay, and then disruptive selection is when you kind of choose against the intermediates and you select for the extremes. Okay, so you get this kind of dip here where we get rid of the middle and we choose the extremes. Okay, and the population gets divided. We call this dimorphism. Dimorphism. Okay, di meaning two, morphs meaning forms. Okay. Alrighty. I think that's all. That's it. Boom.